Ever get that feeling like a big decision somewhere, a boardroom, or maybe even the White House could suddenly shake things up in your own life?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like a butterfly effect thing, right?
Exactly. Well, this announcement of a 25% import tariff on cars and auto parts coming into the U.S., it starts April 3rd. That feels like one of those moments.
No kidding. Big time.
So today we're doing a deep dive into this whole tariff situation, figuring out what's what. I'm your host, and with me today is...
I'm the expert for this one, longtime car industry watcher.
And this isn't just some headline we're skimming over. This could actually change how much you pay for your next car, maybe even change what cars are even available.
Absolutely. We're talking global trade, economics, the whole 9 yards. Our goal today is to really unpack this tariff. What's it all about? Who comes out on top? Who takes a hit? And what does it mean for, the average person listening right now? We've got some great research laid out here, kind of like our roadmap for this deep dive.
Perfect. And it's not just about the big car companies either. This affects all sorts of businesses, international trade, even potentially trickles down to your everyday expenses.
Right, it's a whole ecosystem.
So for this deep dive, we'll start with the nitty-gritty of this 25% tariff. Then we'll see how the global markets reacted, because those stock prices speak volumes. We'll take a close look at what this means for those Korean giants, Hyundai and Kia, see how it hits the auto parts industry, especially the smaller businesses. Then we'll lay out who we think the winners and losers might be in this whole shakeup, how car companies might respond, and of course, what it all means for you, the consumer. And finally, we'll zoom out and consider the bigger picture, the long-term implications. Sound good?
Sounds like a plan. Let's get rolling.
All right, let's start with the actual policy itself. So President Trump announces this permanent 25% tariff, hits all imported cars and key auto parts. We're talking engines, transmissions, the whole drive system, electrical components, everything. Starts April 3rd. What's the driving force behind this?
Well, the official line is pretty clear, right?
Yeah.
It's about boosting American manufacturing, bringing those jobs back home.
Yeah, I think he was pretty upfront about that.
Yeah, the quote was, if you make cars in America, there are no tariffs.
Straight to the point.
The thinking is, there's a lot of capacity in American factories that companies can just scale up, meet the demand.
And this isn't some temporary measure. The word permanent, that's kind of key here.
You got it. He didn't leave much room for interpretation. The quote was, what we want to do is we want to put a 25% tariff on every car that comes into the United States that's not made here. No beating around the bush there.
Now, usually with these trade deals, there are, some exceptions, loopholes, anything like that here.
Well, there is one important exception, but it's temporary. Auto parts that meet the standards of USMCA, that's the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, they get a pass, at least for now.
Interesting. So parts from those countries, if they meet the criteria, they're exempt. I also remember reading something about how the government's expecting, a pretty nice chunk of change from this whole thing.
Yeah, the estimate is about $100 billion in annual revenue. And the plan is to use that money to pay down the federal debt, which, begs the question, does that actually work? Have tariffs historically generated that kind of revenue and actually led to a decrease in debt? Or are there some potential downsides to relying on that income? Something to think about.
Definitely something to keep an eye on. Okay, so that's the policy itself. What happened in the global markets when this news broke? I doubt the car industry was exactly popping champagne.
Let's just say it wasn't a celebratory mood. Stock market reacted instantly. Most of the big car makers saw their stock prices drop, some pretty significantly. Hyundai and Toyota, they both dipped about 2%. Honda got hit a little harder, around 2.5% down. And then the American companies, GM plummeted 7.4%, Ford down 3.9%. Stellantis and Volkswagen, they had smaller drops, around 1.3%.
But there was one outlier in all of this, right? One company that actually seemed to benefit.
Oh yeah, Tesla. Their stock price actually went up a little, 0.4%, which kind of tells you right there what the market thinks about who's going to weather this storm the best.
And I'm guessing that comes down to where these companies are actually building their cars for the American market. The ones making cars in the U.S. are in a much better position, right?
Exactly. The more cars you import, the more exposed you are to this tariff. So Hyundai, only about 40% of their U.S. sales are actually produced here. Kia's a little higher, 44%. Volkswagen's way down at 24%. Now compare that to Ford, they make almost all their cars for the U.S. market right here, 99%. And Tesla, they actually produce more cars in the U.S. than they sell here, 131%.
Wow, that's a big difference. And there was that analyst report we looked at from Bernstein. They really called out Tesla as the winner in this whole situation, didn't they?
They did. They called them, quote, the obvious structural winner. They pointed to their localized production, their strong market share, and their overall insulation from these trade risks. It also makes you think, how does Tesla's direct-to-consumer sales model play into all of this? Does that give them even more flexibility compared to traditional dealerships who are going to be facing price pressure on all these imported cars?
That's a great point. So we can see who's likely breathing a sigh of relief right now. But let's talk about the sheer volume of cars we're talking about here. Can we put some numbers on how many cars are being imported by these big companies every year?
Oh yeah, the numbers are pretty staggering. Toyota brings in 1.07 million vehicles every year. GM, even though they make a lot of cars here, they still import almost 1 million, 980,000. Hyundai's at 550,000, same as Volkswagen. Kia is importing 440,000, and Honda about 400,000.
It's hard to even grasp those numbers.
I know, right? It really puts the potential disruption into perspective. Just think about the logistical nightmare of trying to reroute all those cars, the ripple effects throughout the global supply chain.
Absolutely. And when we say significant impact for certain manufacturers, it sounds like that might be an understatement. Let's zoom in on those Korean automakers, Hyundai and Kia, because it seems like they're especially vulnerable in this situation.
No doubt about it, they're going to be among the hardest hit. Something like 65% of the cars they sell in the US, those aren't made here. In 2024, they sold about 1.7 million cars in the US. Out of that, 1 million cars, that's 57% of their total US sales, came straight from South Korea. And then they also import about 140,000 vehicles from Mexico, which are already subject to a 20% tariff, so that's another headache for them.
And the financial projections aren't looking too rosy either.
Nope. SK Securities, they're projecting a pretty big hit to their operating profit, like a 10.7 trillion Korean won decrease. That's not chump change. It makes you wonder what assumptions they were making about global trade, that left them so exposed compared to some of their rivals.
Now, Hyundai's been making a lot of noise about their new factory in Georgia, that meta plant. You'd think that would, cushion the blow a little from these tariffs.
Well, that's definitely a good move for them in the long run. Billions of dollars invested in U.S. production, that's got to count for something, right? But the problem is, it's mostly focused on electric vehicles and hybrids. And right now, those only make up about 20% of their U.S. sales. That's about 340,000 cars. And only about 12% of those are actually made in the U.S. So the vast majority of their sales are still going to get hit by these tariffs. From what we've gathered, Hyundai was expecting a delay on these tariffs, especially with that huge investment in Georgia in the meta plant opening. It makes sense why they think that, maybe based on past experience or lobbying efforts, but didn't pan out.
And it's not just the finished cars, right? Even some of the cars they assemble here still rely heavily on parts shipped in from overseas, especially South Korea.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. Even if a car is put together in the US, a lot of the parts might be from somewhere else. So take the Hyundai Santa Fe HEV that's assembled in both the US and Canada. Well, 46% of its parts are Korean. The Tucson, same deal, US and Canada assembly. About 30% Korean parts. Kia Sorento, made in the US, has 35% Korean parts. Even the Kia EV6, they assemble 80% in the US, but 15% of the parts are still from South Korea. And all those imported parts are going to be hit with that 25% tariff come May.
It really does sound like a tough spot for them. But it's not just Hyundai and Kia, right? GM Korea is also looking at a pretty big obstacle here.
Right, they rely heavily on exporting to the US. In 2024, they sold 490,000 cars, and a whopping 95% of those were exported. And of those exports, 88.5% went straight to the US. That's about 410,000 cars.
So basically their entire business model is shipping cars to the US. This 25% tariff is a big deal for them.
Huge. We did some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and it looks like they could be looking at over 3 trillion Korean won in extra costs every year just from these tariffs. That's going to force them to make some tough choices. It raises the question of how diversified their production and markets are. Could they shift some of that production to other countries? Maybe focus on different models? It'll be interesting to see how they adapt.
And this whole tariff thing, it's got these wide-reaching consequences, right? It's not just the car makers themselves. What about the companies that make the parts, the suppliers, especially those smaller businesses? Sounds like they're facing a double whammy.
Exactly. For auto parts suppliers, especially in South Korea, this is a tough situation. Auto parts are South Korea's 4th biggest export, so they'll be hit directly with that 25% tariff on anything they ship to the US. But then there's the indirect hit, right? Korean car makers are going to be selling fewer cars in the US because they're more expensive, so that means they'll need fewer parts overall.
And I'm guessing the bigger players in the parts industry, they'll be able to handle this better than the smaller guys.
Right. The big companies like Hyundai Mobis, they've got an EV parts plant here in the US, and HL Mando, they have facilities in Mexico. They might be okay. But the smaller suppliers, especially those who mainly export from South Korea, they've got limited options and resources to adjust to this so quickly.
The CEO of Forvia, Martin Fisher, he had some pretty strong words about this whole situation.
Yeah, he didn't hold back. He said, and I quote, "The entire supply chain cannot absorb a 25% cost increase. It's simply impossible. If this tariff persists, consumers will face higher vehicle prices. The industry cannot swallow a 25% tariff and take the losses."
Wow, straight talk.
It really highlights the fundamental economic reality of this policy. And it's not just about the cost of materials, it's about jobs, innovation, the entire ecosystem. This tariff has the potential to disrupt a lot more than just car prices.
It's like this chain reaction. The car companies, they're going to try to pass these extra costs on to the bigger suppliers who will then squeeze the smaller suppliers.
Exactly. Car makers, they can't just eat a 25% increase in costs. They'll try to pass as much of that on as possible. Which means the big suppliers will be demanding lower prices from the smaller suppliers, putting huge pressure on their profit margins, and as we've seen, potentially even putting some of them out of business. Plus, they might try to cut corners, removing features from vehicles while also raising prices. It's a tough situation all around.
So with all this chaos, who are the potential winners and losers in all of this? Well, Tesla, their name keeps popping up as a big winner.
Yeah, they're looking pretty good right now. They make all the cars they sell in the US right here in the US, so they're basically immune to this tariff on finished cars. Elon Musk did mention they might see some impact because 25–40% of the parts are imported, but compared to companies importing whole car models, they're in a much better position. Plus, as we talked about, that direct-to-consumer model they have, that could be another advantage in a market where prices are going up.
Yeah.
What sets them apart is their foresight, right? They invested heavily in local production early on, which now aligns perfectly with this policy's goals.
Ferrari, that was another surprising name that came up as a potential winner. They import all their cars, so how does that work?
Ferrari, they're in a different league, right?
Yeah.
They sell luxury, high-performance cars. Their customers aren't as worried about price as the average buyer. So they could probably just raise prices a bit, maybe 10% on some models, and it wouldn't really hurt their sales.
Makes sense. For those buyers, a few $1,000s more on a Ferrari, it's probably not a deal breaker. What about businesses that aren't directly making or selling cars? Could they see a benefit from all of this?
Potentially, yeah. Think about auto parts retailers, places like AutoZone and O'Reilly Automotive. If new cars get a lot more expensive, people might hold onto their old cars longer, fix them up instead of buying new ones. That means more demand for those aftermarket parts.
Interesting. And the dealerships, the folks actually selling these cars, how do they fit into all of this?
Well, they might not be hurt as much as you'd think, at least not right away. A big chunk of their profit comes from service and repairs, not just selling new cars. Plus, car makers might try to absorb some of the price increases at first to, soften the blow for consumers, which would also help the dealerships. One analyst we looked at said increasing production of EVs and hybrid vehicles within the U.S. could be a powerful strategy. This segment is growing and has the support of the U.S. government. So dealerships that focus on those models might actually come out ahead.
Okay, so those are the possible winners. Who are the ones likely to take a hit? We've already talked about the import-heavy car manufacturers, but who else?
As we said, Hyundai, Kia, Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, all those companies that rely on imports, they're going to feel the pain. But don't forget about U.S. auto exporters, the ones that assemble cars here but ship them overseas. Ford, GM, Toyota again, BMW, Honda, Mercedes, even Tesla. They could face retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which would really hurt their sales abroad. And here's the thing. These companies, they've built these global supply chains, they rely on open markets. When things change this drastically, it throws a wrench in the whole system. It makes you question the stability of those global networks.
And the parts suppliers, especially the small businesses, they're really caught in the middle of all of this.
Definitely. The car companies are going to try to force them to share the burden of these higher costs. And that pressure trickles down, hitting the smallest suppliers the hardest. And yeah, some of them might not survive.
And at the end of the day, it seems like the average person, the consumer, is the one who really pays the price.
That's the unfortunate reality. New cars are going to get more expensive, no way around it. How much more is up for debate? Evercore ISI says the average increase could be $3,000 to $4,000, but Japanese, Korean, European cars, those could go up as much as $9,375. Goldman Sachs, they're even more pessimistic. They're saying it could be as high as $10,000 to $15,000.
Those are some pretty scary numbers. So how are car companies going to deal with all this in the long run? Packing up and moving their whole factories to the U.S., that seems like a huge task.
It is, and it doesn't seem like they're rushing to do that. CNN reported that most automakers aren't planning to just pick up and move their main production centers. It's just too risky. Relocating a big factory, that's a multi-billion-dollar decision, and it takes years. And who knows how long these tariffs will even last.
GM's CFO, Paul Jacobson, he said something similar, didn't he?
Yeah, he basically said, if the tariffs are permanent, sure, they'll have to rethink things, maybe move some production. But there's no guarantee these tariffs will stay in place. He said, we invested billions of dollars. What if the policy is discontinued? You can't keep changing your business strategy.
It makes you wonder what the tipping point is for them, right? At what point does the uncertainty become too much and they decide to make a move?
So if they're not moving their factories, what are they going to do?
Well, they've got a few options. First, they can raise prices. Kia's CFO, Kim Sung-jin, he's already said they're planning on that. They'll also try to cut costs wherever they can. Companies like Hyundai and Kia, they might try to make more cars in their existing U.S. plants, expand their production here. There's also the diplomatic route. South Korea might try to negotiate some kind of deal, maybe offer something else in return for easing up on the tariffs, like increased defense spending or buying more American natural gas. And finally, they might try to make more parts in the U.S. or source more parts from Mexico and Canada, those USMCA countries.
It feels like the average car buyer is going to get caught in the middle of all this. We're talking thousands of dollars added to the price of a new car. Ken Kim, a senior economist at KPMG, he didn't sugarcoat the impact on consumers.
Not at all. He said new car prices will increase by thousands of dollars and potentially by more than $10,000 due to tariffs. He then pointed out that with the average new car costing around $48,500, that could be a 20% increase. And, this is happening when people are already struggling with inflation. It's tough all around. It makes you think about the potential unintended consequences, right?
Yeah.
A policy meant to protect American jobs could end up hurting consumers and even leading to job losses in other industries.
So besides sticker shock at the dealership, what else might we see happen?
Well, new car sales are probably going to go down. People just won't buy as many if they're so much more expensive. But then used car prices might go up because people will hold on to their old cars longer. And this all feeds into inflation, right? Cars are a big part of the economy. Plus, repairs are going to get more expensive too because those imported parts will cost more. And finally, some car companies might just stop selling certain models in the US, the ones that aren't as profitable. Less choice for consumers. S&P Global Mobility, they're predicting a drop in US car sales from 16 million in 2024 down to 14.5 to 15 million.
It's really a domino effect, isn't it? One policy change can have such widespread consequences. It also raises the question, what does this mean for innovation in the auto industry? Will this stifle the development of new technologies or models if manufacturers are focused on simply navigating these immediate challenges?
That's a great point. It definitely shifts the priorities.
The big question is, how long are these tariffs going to stick around? Is this the new normal, or is it a temporary thing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Nobody knows for sure. Professor Kim Taiwan from Myungji University, he had an interesting take. He said, Trump needs to prove the severity of his trade policies, especially toward China and India. He's basically saying these tariffs might be a way to show he's serious about trade. He went on to say, in the worst-case scenario, the auto tariffs could last for at least 1 to 2 months. So he seems to think it's a short-term tactic. He also pointed out that South Korea and other allies have been caught in the crossfire as Trump tries to rein in 2 countries that pose a major threat to the U.S. economy. So it's all part of a bigger geopolitical chess game. It makes you wonder how other countries are reacting to this, right? Are they considering their own retaliatory measures? Is this the start of a global trade war?
So maybe these tariffs are just a bargaining chip in some larger trade negotiation.
Could be. It's really hard to say what's going to happen. Maybe they'll adjust the tariffs after some talks with South Korea. Or maybe car prices just stay high and we all get used to it. If the tariffs stay in place for a long time, then maybe more companies will start making more cars here in the US. And who knows, maybe this will actually speed up the shift to electric vehicles if making those here becomes more profitable than importing gas-powered cars. We also came across a graphic. It's titled, Projected Change in Hyundai Motor Group Operating Profit Under a 25% Tariff. even without the specific numbers, it really drives home the point about the financial hit Hyundai's expecting.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, let's answer some of the basic questions people might have. So first off, when do these tariffs actually start?
Okay, so the tariffs on imported cars, those kick in April 3rd, 2025. And then the tariffs on auto parts, those start a month later, May 3rd, 2025.
And just to remind everyone, how bad is this going to hurt the Korean car industry?
Pretty bad. SK Securities is saying Hyundai and Kia could see a 10.7 trillion won drop in their profits. And the Industrial Bank of Korea, they're saying overall Korean auto exports could fall by 18.6% this year, which is about 9 trillion won.
And how much more are we talking about paying for a new car?
On average, somewhere between $3,000 and $4,000 more. But for some imported cars, especially those from Japan, Korea, and Europe, it could be as much as $9,375. That's according to Evercore ISI. And Goldman Sachs, you're saying it could even hit $15,000 in some cases.
Yikes. Why don't these car companies just move their factories to the US? Wouldn't that solve the problem?
It's not that simple. Building a car factory is a massive multi-billion-dollar project. It takes at least 3 years, sometimes more. And car companies are hesitant to do that when they don't know if these tariffs will even last that long. Plus, they'd have to completely rework their supply chains, which is a huge headache.
So, just to be clear, which cars are affected by this?
Pretty much all imported cars. Sedans, SUVs, minivans, cargo vans, light trucks, you name it. And for parts, it's things like engines, transmissions, drive systems, electrical stuff. But remember, parts that qualify under the USMCA, those are exempt for now.
And lastly, what about companies like Tesla, who already make most of their cars here in the US? How does this affect them?
They're in a good spot. They'll be less affected than most, and they might even benefit because their competitors will be at a disadvantage. They do import some parts, so they're not totally immune, but overall, they're in a much stronger position than companies that rely heavily on imports.
So to sum it all up, this 25% import tariff, it's a big deal. It's going to affect the whole car industry, from the biggest manufacturers down to the smallest suppliers. And ultimately, it's going to hit consumers in the wallet.
Exactly. If you're thinking about buying a new car, a used car, or even just fixing up the car you have, expect to pay more.
And it makes you think, how is this going to change the way we think about transportation in the long run? Will this accelerate the shift to electric vehicles? Will it make American manufacturing more competitive? And what about other industries? Could they be next? It's something to consider. The broader implications of these kinds of protectionist policies, it goes way beyond just the cars we drive.
It's a global story, that's for sure. And it's just getting started.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for tuning in.
Until next time.